The 21st century was supposed to belong to China. For decades, the world assumed that Beijing's rise was inevitable, that Asia's destiny would be written in Mandarin, and that the United States would have no choice but to accommodate the new hegemon. But something happened on the road to that future, something that few predicted: the quiet but decisive rise of another giant, one that now stands at the crossroads of global power. That giant is India. And today, as Washington and New Delhi deepen their embrace, a new Asian order is taking shape, one that could define the next 100 years. This is not an alliance born of sentiment. It is a partnership forged in the crucible of necessity. For the United States, the calculus is clear. The unipolar world is gone, the post-Cold War illusion of permanent supremacy shattered. China is not just a competitor, it is a systemic rival, economically, militarily, technologically. To contain its ambitions, America needs partners who can do what its own resources no longer allow: project influence in regions too vast for any one power to dominate. And in Asia, there is only one partner that truly fits the bill. Not Japan, whose demographics and pacifist constitution constrain its reach. Not Australia, whose power is real but limited. Only India, massive, democratic, strategically located and rising, has the weight to tilt the scales. For India, the equation is no less compelling. For decades, it defined itself by what it was not aligned, not beholden, not entangled. That era is over. In a world where borders may not move but influence does, India understands that autonomy cannot mean isolation. It must mean leverage, the ability to shape outcomes rather than suffer them. And that leverage comes from partnerships, not dependencies. With the United States, India finds a partner that can accelerate its ascent without dictating its destiny. Access to cutting-edge technologies, investment in critical infrastructure, a voice in global forums long dominated by Western powers, all these are on offer. But unlike the alliances of the Cold War, this is not about joining someone else's camp. It is about building a new geometry of power, one where India is not a spoke in an American wheel, but a hub in a multipolar order. The evidence is everywhere for those who care to see it. The defense deals that once trickled now flow like rivers. Jet engine co-production agreements, drone manufacturing partnerships, joint exercises that span the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Rim, space collaboration that reaches beyond Earth, semiconductor investments that secure the supply chains of tomorrow. These are not transactions, they are tectonic shifts. They signal that the old walls between East and West, between democracy and development, are crumbling, and in their place rises a bridge with India at its center. But to grasp the significance of this shift, one must understand the stakes. The Indo-Pacific is not just a region, it is the cockpit of the 21st century, a theater where trade routes carry 2/3 of global commerce, where undersea cables pulse with the data that drives economies, where rivalries can ignite wars that ripple across continents. For decades, China believed it could dominate this space uncontested, using its Belt and Road Initiative to encircle the Indian Ocean, using its navy to project power into the South China Sea. That strategy worked until now. Because today, standing astride the sea lanes from Malacca to Hormuz is a new alignment, an India that is no longer content to hug its shores, and an America that knows it cannot police these waters alone. Together they are crafting a strategy that goes beyond ships and bases. It is about building resilience of supply chains, of technologies, of alliances. The Quad, once dismissed as a diplomatic hobby, is now a pillar of regional security. Its agenda goes beyond military drills to vaccines, climate action, and critical technology, signaling a recognition that power in this century is not only about who commands armies, but about who builds systems. And here India is indispensable, not as a client, but as a co-architect. This is what makes the India-U.S. partnership different from America's alliances with Japan or South Korea. Those were relationships of dependence, cemented by treaties that left little room for autonomy. This is something else, a convergence of interests that respects sovereignty. India does not take orders, it takes options. It buys Russian oil, even as it drills with American warships. It signs defense deals with France, even as it co-produces engines with General Electric. To some in Washington, this is frustrating. To Delhi, it is non-negotiable. Strategic autonomy is not a slogan, it is the spine of India's statecraft. And paradoxically, it is this autonomy that makes the partnership sustainable. Because what binds these nations is not fear alone, but a shared vision of a world where rules matter more than rulers, where seas remain open, where technologies empower rather than enslave. The impact of this partnership is already rippling outward. In Beijing, it is seen as encirclement, proof that America is forging an Asian NATO to contain China's rise. In Moscow, it is viewed with unease, a sign that its old friend India is drifting westward, even as it still buys Russian arms. In Islamabad, it is cause for panic, confirmation that the era of hyphenated diplomacy is over, and that India now occupies a space Pakistan can only dream of. But for the rest of Asia, it is something else, a reassurance that the future will not be written in a single language, that there is room for a balance of power that prevents hegemony from taking root. This is why the India-U.S. story is not just a story of two nations. It is the story of a system struggling to adapt to the end of unipolarity. It is the story of how democracies, once content to lecture the world, are learning to collaborate without condescension. And above all, it is the story of an India that has stopped asking for a seat at the table and started building the table itself. When historians look back on this moment, they may not speak of grand declarations or dramatic treaties. They will speak of quieter things, a jet engine factory in Karnataka, a semiconductor plant in Gujarat, a naval exercise in the Bay of Bengal. Because it is in these details that the destiny of nations is written, not in the language of ideology, but in the grammar of interests. And the grammar of this century is being drafted right now in the dialogue between Washington and New Delhi. This is not the Asian order anyone predicted. It is the Asian order that reality demands. And at its heart is a partnership that is neither alliance nor accident, but something rarer, an understanding that the future belongs not to those who cling to the past, but to those who build the bridges across its ruins. India and the United States are building those bridges. And in doing so, they are rewriting the map of power, one corridor, one code, one handshake at a time. The deeper you look into this partnership, the more you realize it is not about headlines. It is about hardware, software, and the unseen threads of power that bind economies, militaries, and minds. The India-U.S. relationship is often spoken of in terms of values, democracies joining hands in a world of autocrats. But in truth, it is being built in the language of pragmatism in supply chains, in satellite launches, in factories that hum with the promise of the future. Take technology. For decades, the United States guarded its crown jewels, semiconductors, advanced electronics, space technology, keeping them behind walls of export controls. Today, those walls are crumbling. Washington is not giving away secrets out of charity. It is making a calculated bet. In a world where technology is the new terrain of power, and where China is racing to dominate everything from AI to quantum computing, America needs partners who can innovate, scale, and secure. India fits that bill. It has the engineers, the market, and the will. Already, semiconductor giants are investing billions to build fabrication plants on Indian soil, turning a country once dependent on imports into a potential hub for chips, the brain of the modern economy. Defense tells a similar story. For decades, India's arsenal bore the imprint of Moscow. Russian tanks rolled across its plains. Russian fighters patrolled its skies. Russian submarines lurked in its waters. That legacy has not vanished overnight, but it is being diluted by deals that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Made helicopters ferry Indian troops across the Himalayas. American surveillance aircraft scan the Indian Ocean for hostile submarines. And now the holy grail of defense cooperation, co-production. Jet engines, long a symbol of technological sovereignty, will soon be manufactured in India under agreements with U.S. firms, a transfer of know-how that even close U.S. allies struggle to secure. This is not about selling weapons, it is about sharing the capacity to build them. And that is a signal of trust, of permanence, of a relationship that has moved beyond buyer and seller to something approaching partnership of equals. But perhaps the most strategic frontier is the Indo-Pacific itself. This vast expanse, stretching from the eastern shores of Africa to the western coast of the Americas, is the lifeline of global trade and the fault line of global rivalry. For years, the U.S. Navy sailed these waters as the unchallenged guarantor of security. That era is over. China now boasts the world's largest navy, building ships at a pace the U.S. cannot match. It has fortified reefs into military outposts, claimed seas as sovereign territory, and sought to bend maritime law to its will. Against this backdrop, India's role is not cosmetic, it is crucial. With its geographic position astride the Indian Ocean, with its bases from the Andamans to the Arabian Sea, and with a navy that is rapidly modernizing, India is the natural counterweight to China's maritime ambitions. Joint exercises like Malabar, once symbolic, are now operationally significant, bringing together U.S., Indian, Japanese, and Australian forces in rehearsals for contingencies no one wants to name but everyone prepares for. Logistics agreements allow warships and aircraft to refuel and resupply at each other's bases, stitching together a lattice of interoperability across two oceans. Intelligence sharing arrangements, once hampered by mistrust, now enable real-time coordination. These are not theatrics. They are the scaffolding of a security architecture designed to deter without declaring, to balance without binding India into a rigid alliance it does not want. This is the genius of India's approach, and the reason it unnerves not just Beijing, but Moscow as well. Unlike America's traditional allies, India refuses to mortgage its autonomy. It buys oil from Russia even as it deepens ties with Washington. It conducts military drills with the U.S. one month and with Russia the next. It joins forums led by the West, while staying active in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. To some, this looks like hedging. To India, it is strategy, a refusal to be trapped in binary choices, a determination to turn multipolarity, from a slogan into a system. And yet, for all its flexibility, India knows where the gravitational pull lies. In technology, in trade, in the currency of future power. The West, not Russia, not China, holds the commanding heights. Aligning with that ecosystem is not an act of subservience, it is an act of survival. The challenge is to do so without surrendering the very thing that gives India its leverage, independence. That tightrope walk defines the India-U.S. story, and so far India is walking it with remarkable skill. What does this mean for Asia? Everything. Because the rise of this partnership does more than check China, it rewires the incentives of an entire region. It tells Southeast Asian nations that they are not doomed to choose between Beijing and Washington, that there is a third option, a balance of powers anchored by India's rise. It tells Europe that engagement with the Indo-Pacific need not flow only through America, that Delhi can be a gateway, and it tells the global South that partnerships with the West need not mean lectures on democracy or austerity, that they can mean co-development, co-innovation, co-prosperity. For China, this is a strategic nightmare. It has spent 2 decades building a maritime and economic architecture to lock Asia into its orbit: ports, pipelines, railways, digital networks. Now a rival architecture is emerging, less formal but more flexible, one that Beijing cannot easily bully, because its core rests on something China does not possess: trust. Nations trust India in ways they will never trust China, not because India is perfect, but because it does not seek vassals. It seeks partners. That difference, subtle but profound, could decide the shape of this century. For Russia, the challenge is existential. It still sees India as its partner, its market, its diplomatic buffer. But as Moscow grows dependent on Beijing, it risks losing India not overnight, not completely, but enough to tilt the balance of its influence. The irony is bitter. A country that once prided itself on strategic depth now finds its most important Asian partner walking toward Washington's embrace, not in defiance, but in quiet inevitability. And for Pakistan, the implications need no elaboration. The dream of parity is dead. The era when Washington weighed its words to avoid offending Islamabad is over. Today the conversation is not about hyphens or equations. It is about leverage, and India has it in spades. Every deal signed with Washington, every corridor mapped in the Indo-Pacific, widens the gap between a rising power and a state trapped in the amber of its own insecurities. Where does all this lead? Not to an alliance, at least not in the old sense. There will be no Asian NATO, no treaty obliging mutual defense. India will not march under another nation's flag. But make no mistake, the geometry of power is shifting, and its center of gravity is moving toward a network where India and the United States are principal nodes. Around them will cluster other actors: Japan, Australia, perhaps even Europe, creating not a bloc but a mesh, resilient enough to withstand shocks, flexible enough to adapt to crises. The world is not returning to bipolarity. It is entering something more complex, a web of overlapping partnerships, where strength flows not from isolation, but from interconnection. And in that web, the India-U.S. partnership is not just another strand, it is the anchor. Because if the Indo-Pacific is the cockpit of this century, then these two nations, working in concert, are its pilots, steering a course through turbulence toward a horizon no one can yet fully see. History will judge whether they succeed. But one thing is certain: the map of Asia will never look the same again. And when future generations trace the lines of that map, they may find that they converge here, in the handshake between Delhi and Washington, and in the understanding that power, in this age belongs not to those who dominate alone, but to those who dare to collaborate as equals.